If you know this channel at all, you know that Breath of the Wild is one of my favorite, if not my absolute favorite game of all time. With that being said, these are 10 things that I would love to see in Breath of the Wild 2. What's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. It's Dusty, one half of Radiant Gaming, and no matter how ridiculous, no matter how unlikely, no matter how likely some of these things are, these are things that I feel like would be awesome in Breath of the Wild 2, definitely things I want to see in Breath of the Wild 2, and things that I think that whenever Breath of the Wild 2 gets released, if these are in there, will make the game that much better. One of those things is longer time with weapons, and I think it's universally agreed by Breath of the Wild fans that the weapon times that we had in Breath of the Wild just wasn't long enough. I felt like they broke way too fast, and honestly we would get a sword or a spear that we absolutely loved, and then by the time we even got to use it a few times, it just shattered. It also kind of made me develop some sort of nature that if I was watching someone else play Breath of the Wild and they had, say, a level 12, a level 17, and a level 34 weapon in their inventory, if they used a level 34 weapon before they used a level 12 or level 17 weapon and the 34 broke before them, I would internally literally freak out. It actually felt like I would get these high level weapons and never even use them because I just didn't want them to break. I thought they were cool to have in my inventory and I wanted to save them for something super special. And I'm not saying by any means that I want unbreakable weapons. I really don't. I want the breakable weapon system. I just want it to last maybe a little longer. I think that the breakable weapon system is super cool and just something just to add a little spice to the game, just to kind of let you get attached to a weapon and then it break and be like, hey, you gotta go find a new one. Adds to more adventure aspects and just adds to all around more time in the game, creating more memories. But maybe just let us keep our weapons just a little longer. And then something else I would like to see in this game is a more memorable soundtrack. And I mean, I get it. I know why they did it. I know why the soundtrack is more ominous and more low and just more kind of just less of a soundtrack and more of a atmosphere. I understand it. It actually fits Breath of the Wild perfectly, and I love that they did that. But in Breath of the Wild 2, I would love to have a more memorable soundtrack. Think of a game like Final Fantasy if you've ever played one. You can more than likely hear a song from a specific Final Fantasy game you love and be transported back. The song that comes to my mind is To Xanarkhan from Final Fantasy X. Whenever I hear that song, it transports me back to my wife and I's earlier years of marriage to when we were living with her parents. I know exactly where we were when we beat that game, and I remember playing that game exactly in that room we were in, and I remember the emotions we felt when we beat that game. Literally driving to church, halfway in tears after we beat Final Fantasy X, and just having that song play just creates some sort of feeling in me that I feel like Breath of the Wild 2 could really benefit from. I think that Breath of the Wild 2 being the most anticipated and most iconic game for the Nintendo Switch arguably really needs this. I think with the game looking as awesome as it does, and knowing that this game more than likely is going to blow our minds more than Breath of the Wild 1 did, I think an iconic soundtrack or an iconic song would just absolutely be the cherry on top to this game. And in that same line, an incredible song would only be that good if it had an incredible story, right? For example, the To Xanarkhan song would just be a good song had you not played Final Fantasy X. But if you did play Final Fantasy X and you listen to that song has some weight to it. I'm not going to spoil that game by no means, but if you know what happens with that song, you will know the weight that it carries. And first of all, I know that Legend of Zelda and Final Fantasy are two totally different games. I realize that Legend of Zelda is about more than just super deep storytelling. But say that it does incorporate a super deep story into Breath of the Wild 2. And this is actually something I've said since I played Breath of the Wild 1. Of course, as I mentioned before, Breath of the Wild is one of my favorite, if not my all-time favorite game of all time. But I just feel like the story wasn't there for what they were trying to show us. Not that it was a bad story by any means, but the story was mainly achieved through memories, which were optional. And just think of all the lore they actually did set up with Breath of the Wild 1 that they could absolutely capitalize on in Breath of the Wild 2. And I think with knowing that the map that we're going to have in Breath of the Wild 2 is kind of the same that we had in Breath of the Wild 1, hopefully bigger obviously, and then obviously the sky and more exploration. But a lot of what we already have is there, right? So what's stopping them from incorporating a super awesome story in Breath of the Wild 2? And think of if the main story is actually that amazing as I'm hoping that it is. Say they did the side quest adding more emphasis on the story and just adding more background to the story than we already have. I think that that would give me more purpose to do side quests rather than leaving some unfinished, and I think that a lot of fans would really appreciate that. And if they did that, I would probably be the happiest person alive, because as fun as Breath of the Wild 1 was and just how massive and mind-boggling the game was, I get that they probably didn't want that to be overshadowed by a super crazy in-depth story. But now that we have Breath of the Wild 2 and we've experienced kind of the same area, I want that story story to be there. And I hope what you're hearing is not, hey, make this a Final Fantasy story. I'm not saying that at all. I want this to be a Legend of Zelda story. I want it to be a Breath of the Wild 2 story, but I want it to be in depth and I want it to be amazing. Another thing I want in Breath of the Wild 2 is more creative bosses and more creative enemies. And this one I feel like is pretty likely to happen, as Aonuma did say there will be new encounters. After you play Breath of the Wild 1 for a few hours, you'll more than likely notice you're pretty much just fighting the same enemies over and over and over. This does not make the game bad by any stretch of the imagination, but you're pretty much just fighting different variations of Bokoblins, Moblins, Lynels, and Octoroks. And in the new trailer, we actually do see a new enemy that actually looks like, thanks to our friend Shadow who pointed it out, an Igor, or a dungeon. There's also different variations of enemies, as you see a Bokoblin fort on top of a stone talus. So that's cool that we get something new in different variations, and I'm excited to see what else we're going to get. I think this will definitely keep a lot of fans interested for longer, and something that I feel like that they're going to put in Breath of the Wild 2, as it does seem super likely, but something that I still would love to see in Breath of the Wild 2. Then another thing that Aonuma actually mentioned was in the delay of Breath of the Wild 2, and that is that the expanded world goes beyond that. Of course, speaking of the sky and then the land that we already had in Breath of the Wild 1. When I heard this, I was like, what? That's awesome. And I think I speak for a lot of fans whenever I say that I don't want Breath of the Wild 2 to just be Breath of the Wild 1 DLC. I definitely think it's going to be bigger than anything we can imagine, but man, if it wasn't refreshing to hear Aonuma himself say that the expanded world goes beyond that. I know a lot of fans have theorized what he meant by this, and a lot of fans have come up with, oh, that means underwater exploration. I personally feel like that's kind of thinking too small. When I first heard this, I definitely thought, okay, wow, that's awesome. That means the map is going to be wider and bigger than it already was in Breath of the Wild 1. And you may be thinking, no, Dusty, that's completely impossible. But think about it. This game has been worked on for a long time. And with that in mind, and knowing that they're pretty much working on top of a finished game, what's really stopping them from making the map, say, 1.5 times or double the size of the map in Breath of the Wild 1? This is kind of definitely what I'm cautiously expecting. If it doesn't happen, it won't ruin the game for me, but I really hope that's what we get. And say I am misinterpreting Aonuma, I still don't feel like underwater exploration is where it's going to go. I feel like it's more underground exploration. Hopefully underwater exploration's in there. That would be really cool, as you could swim, but you couldn't dive underneath the water. But I personally would like to see underground exploration above underwater exploration. I just hate underwater exploration in games. I can't help it. And for example, in the 2019 trailer, we did see Link and Zelda walking around in what looked like an underground cave or a dungeon. And actually, if you slow down the trailer right here, you will see what looks to be an entrance to a cave or an entrance to, say, a dungeon. Which leads me to my next point, which is before you go there, no, it is not. Bring back the old style dungeons to Breath of the Wild 2. Make it just like the old dungeons in the old Legend of Zelda game. But instead, I would like to have both styles of dungeons. And I know this is a touchy subject for Legend of Zelda fans, but I was completely okay with the dungeon system in Breath of the Wild. I personally really enjoyed going through the trials in Breath of the Wild, and I thought they did a phenomenal job with it. And I know they can't do the exact same thing in Breath of the Wild 2, but if they did something similar, I would be fine with that. I would, however, like to see some iteration of the original dungeon style in Breath of the Wild 2, and I feel like whenever we slow the trailer down right here, it does kind of seem like that's what we're going to get. And that may be a bold prediction, but hey, to me, that's what it looks like. And I definitely want to know what you think. Drop it in the comment section below. Would you rather have the older style dungeons in Breath of the Wild 2? Or are you okay with the dungeon style in Breath of the Wild 1? Or do you want both? And then going back to what Aonuma said about the expanded world going beyond the land and the sky that we already have seen, I can't help but wonder, how are we going to get around this map? How are we going to get up to the sky levels? And I know we have the new ability where you can kind of go through the masses above you, but are we really going to be able to do that from like say 40, 50 or however many feet below on the ground going up to the sky? I think this is something that not a lot of Breath of the Wild 2 fans are talking about. And knowing that this game does have a lot of Skyward Sword themes, could it mean that this game could have flying creatures or Loftwings? I think that would be awesome and definitely something I want. And even Pokemon Legends Arceus lets you fly around on Braviary, and I think something like that would be cool in Breath of the Wild 2. And say the map does get expanded the way I want it to, it makes it bigger than the Breath of the Wild 1 map, flying would just make a ton of sense. And while I'm aware that the flying aspect could take away from the exploration, like just like in Breath of the Wild 1, even riding the horse kind of took away the exploration for me, as I really enjoy just walking around and exploring every nook and cranny of this game. But I mean, the way Link is falling in the 2021 trailer that we've seen really resembles the way Link falls before he calls the Loftwing in Skyward Sword. And I definitely think that would be an awesome touch to throw this in Breath of the Wild 2 to be able to fly around on hopefully a Loftwing, if not another flying creature. And maybe, I don't know, maybe restricted until like in game or something. That way you can explore the whole map. I don't know. However they do it, I feel like will be awesome. The next one on our list, I would have never even considered had we not seen the dungeon in the 2019 trailer. But it's that maybe possibly could they throw a co-op aspect into Breath of the Wild 2? How cool would it be to explore Hyrule with your spouse or with a friend? And I realize no Legend of Zelda game has ever done that before, but Breath of the Wild 1 broke a lot of rules too. I personally think it would be so fun to run around Hyrule with my wife, with me playing Link and her playing Zelda and just exploring together. And I do realize this is going to be hard to do, and the map being massive as we can assume would be kind of hard to throw co-op in there, and I can only begin to imagine how the camera angles would work. But that would be cool, and it's definitely not something I'm banking on. It's not a make or break for the game, but I think that would be a nice touch to throw in Breath of the Wild 2. Depending on how the story goes and if Link and Zelda are even together through this game, we're not for sure yet, but if they are, I think that would be a nice aspect. The next one on our list is something that I've seen someone post online, and I have to 100% agree with the points that they made. One component of Breath of the Wild 1 that really drove me crazy was that I had a lot of stuff in my inventory that went completely unused. And they mentioned that more crafting in Breath of the Wild 2 would be awesome, so that some of this stuff in our inventory doesn't just sit there through the whole game. I hardly ever made elixirs, so my inventory was pretty much chock full of just useless monster parts. I also really didn't cook that much, and when I did, I pretty much just used the same thing over and over and over. I mean, baking 5 apples to get 50 gil and just selling those and making 50 gil at a time was pretty much all I did with cooking, other than, you know, if I went to fight a boss and leveled up my hearts a little bit. So it'd be cool to see them implement some sort of in-depth crafting system in Breath of the Wild 2, and I've even seen some people say, hey, make it to where we can craft our weapons back and restore them back to full health. And I, for one, think that would be awesome. As I did mention earlier, I would love to see longer duration of our weapons, and I don't want to see unbreakable weapons, but the ability to craft them back to full health I think would be such an awesome touch. I also think it would be cool to maybe craft armor or something with monster parts. However they do it, I don't know. I just want to get some of these items out of my inventory that I never ever use. And then the last thing on my list is something that I feel like is also super likely, and something that I pretty much would guarantee is going to be in Breath of the Wild 2, and that is the development of the land from Breath of the Wild 1. Breath of the Wild 2 is supposed to take place 2 years after the events of Breath of the Wild 1, so seeing more towns rebuilt and more evolution of just the complete land of Breath of the Wild 1 would be something awesome to see in Breath of the Wild 2. Maybe seeing some parts around the castle being rebuilt, seeing some little villages and towns pop up, and then, you know, ultimately being destroyed because of the castle lifting up into the air. But of course, I mean, just the atmosphere of 2 years after the events of Breath of the Wild 1. What can we expect to see? More towns, more villages, more houses and stuff. Basically what I mean is I don't want to just see the same exact map from Breath of the Wild 1. I want there to be a slight difference, since 2 years have gone by since Breath of the Wild 1 in this game. And that's all I have for today, guys. If I was developing Breath of the Wild 2 tomorrow, these are the 10 things I would put in there that I think would make this game that much better. And who knows, some of these may already be in the game and we just don't know it. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button. Also subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss a video. This is one half of Our Radiant Gaming signing off. Everyone have an awesome day and God bless.